Well, good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Pinellas County Historical Society, I'd like to welcome you to our March 2015 Speaking of History program. Today's program is going to focus on another journey across our beautiful state. We're very fortunate to have back with us Cathy Salustri, who is a graduate of the University of South Florida, St. Petersburg's Florida Studies program. This is her third, I believe, visit and tour of the state. Today she's going to take us across the state to look at A1A. A graduate of the Florida Studies program, Cathy has become very involved locally with a lot of cultural and historical organizations when she's not researching, writing, and working with her blogs and her other activities. She's been very involved with the Gulfport Historical Society, for example, and has done a lot of wonderful work down there. Her talk today is going to take us to the other side of the state, looking at what is A1A today and how driving along the east coast of Florida has changed over the last 70 years. Cathy, it's great to have you back.
Thanks, Jim. Thank you. During the Great Depression, the federal government paid writers to create a series of guides. In each state, the Federal Writers Project paid writers with no jobs and no prospects, which is to say all writers, to create driving tours of that state. The plan was to put writers to work, encourage people to travel, stimulate the economy, and capture bits of Americana. Today, the cool thing about the guides is that since they were written well before the advent of the Eisenhower interstate system, they're an amazingly thorough tour book. Go into a Barnes & Noble and look around their Florida section. And there you're going to find guides to traveling Florida with your kids, your dogs, your iguana, whatever. You'll find regional guides and maybe one or two small books about what you're going to see along the interstate, which, by the way, is nothing. You will find Florida for lovers, for families, for gay people, for bikers, for hikers, for fish. But what you will not find in any bookstore is any sort of comprehensive guide to the Sunshine State. There is no simple, this is Florida for everyone guide. Now, because of that, I always found it kind of odd that since it was last printed in the mid-1950s, no one ever updated the guide to the Southernmost State. So when I took pretty much every class the USF St. Pete Florida Studies program had in Florida, and they said, look, you need to write a thesis. You need to go. You need to graduate. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to go see what happened to those old tours. So I went to my professor, Gary Mormino, and I said, hey, you know how everyone else is looking into what happened to all the citrus groves and how much more drinking water we're going to be able to process as a state and all these really important things? And he said, yeah, and I said, yeah, I'm not going to do anything like that. I am going to take a month and I'm going to drive around Florida and I'm going to follow this old book and I'm going to write about it. And he said, okay. So it wasn't simply that easy. The first thing I had to do was, well, it took several months. I had to figure out what happened to all the old roads. You see, you can't just put a road down in 1939 and try and pick it up again almost 75 years later. Florida, if you've driven I-4, 75 or 95 or really any road, you know that we're kind of a state of construction. And not only do the roads shift a little bit every time we repave them, sometimes up to almost a half a mile, I found. They don't even have the same numbers anymore. So I had this shiny red road atlas called the Florida Gazetteer, and I went through each of the guide's 22 routes, and I tried to figure out where each of the roads went, because they've been piecemealed into other roads, or they've been rerouted completely. And like I said, they don't have the same numbers, and Florida does not have a lot of road historians. So I spent a few months obsessing over these routes, hunched over our dining room table, and it involved pretty much a lot of swearing at the atlas and the state. And my partner in crime through all this, Barry, most likely worried that this was the start of some sort of Howard Hughes descent into madness. This was a feeling I think that was going to get a lot worse before the project was over. This, by the way, is what that brand new atlas looks like now. It's been through a lot. Now, Barry was so optimistic about this that he not only offered to go with me, he said, you know what? Let's go camping and I'll drive you. Let's take a full month. So in the September 2011, we loaded up a 21-foot camper van with a dog, my computer, more notes on roads than you could possibly imagine, and we started painstakingly crisscrossing every back road in Florida. We followed every mile the original guide writers did, and we even created our own tour, a new one, because in 1937, which was the actual date they traveled the state, there was no A1A. Now, when we started this, as I said, I had Barry's unrelenting support, but he had no qualms about telling me he dreaded A1A. I was not looking forward to it either, but in the end, we loved it so much that we did it again 2 years later. But the first time it was the final leg of our journey, and we were tired. We smelled like road. Even the dog was defeated. The look on her face every night when we backed into the campsite was just like, oh God, not this again. Florida had been very overwhelming. We put almost 5,000 miles on that van, and we were exhausted with the different cultures, the different economics, the different economies, and the idea of tooling down this 2-lane road that was overflowing with slow drivers and big white cars appealed to absolutely none of us. You see, we were doing the same thing a lot of people do. You drive 10 miles on A1A and subsequently paint the whole of the road with the memories of those 10 miles. Usually those 10 miles are part of some sort of drunken spring break adventure, maybe an early morning surfing safari, or a sightseeing tour as you got off the interstate. While these things might be the best known parts of A1A, they are certainly not all of A1A. In parts, the road runs on top of sand dunes and fronts the cobalt blue of the Atlantic. In other parts, it does go through a pretty horrible glut of t-shirt shops, low-rent tourist traps, but every inch of the road does speak to a different part of Florida. I kind of think of it now as a compendium of the whole state, and although it didn't exist when the WPA riders toured the state, I think today they would have preferred it. In fact, one of the reasons we chose to drive this state was drive this road instead of US 1 was because of my great-grandfather. Called him Pop. This is him and me a long time ago. He died before I turned 5, so I don't really remember too much more than what's in this picture, but I think it's possible I got my obsessive need for road trips from him. He lived in New York, because that's where we all start, right? And every year he would hop on US 1 and he would head to Florida. He started before the Eisenhower interstate system, so what he would do is he would get on US 1 and drive it south. Now, the US 1 that he saw was most likely a lot more similar to the one that the guide riders saw. You see, they described it as a chain of salt lagoons separated from the ocean by low-lying islands and narrow reefs. As we perched at the top of the state, though, thinking about going down A1A, it quickly became clear that the road described above had shifted. It was gone. But what happened in the guide is the riders talked about all these endless side trips over to the east to an unconnected chain of barrier islands, separated from the mainlands and each other by shallow tidal lagoons that would later become the Intracoastal Waterway, or the ICW. Today, A1A connects these low-lying islands, and they have names like Fernandina Beach, Daytona Beach, even the dreaded South Beach. Bridges and no small amount of dredging make traveling A1A stem to stern a practical reality, with a few relationship testing exceptions that I'll get to in just a moment. Today, though, US 1 just has a lot of byproducts of development along it. It's morphed from a low-lying road showcasing tidal pools to more of a haven for homogenization, symbolized most greatly by the repeated presence of franchise surf shops and Dollar General stores. Some things remain unchanged, though. US 1 still brings you into Florida by crossing the St. Mary's River, and that's still where we started this journey, at the top. This is what you see when you first come into Florida. Now picture the first of 22 tours in an unknown state. The guide came well before anybody dreamed about owning a piece of Florida as part of the American dream. So for this new beginning, consider two-lane bridges spanning the tea-colored St. Mary's River that deliver you to the Sunshine State. Today, of course, this is not the Florida we all expect. It's not the Florida that the hotel brochures or the Visitors Bureau promises us. You can't see a sandy beach anywhere from this vista, and even the river appears dirty, as I've heard more than one person exclaim as they gaze with horror into this Blackwater River. The fact is, tannins, which is a fancy name for the substance pronounced when things like twigs and leaves rot, are what give this watery color, the river, its watery dahlia, kind of a black color, not toxins. Now, I doubt in the 1930s that travelers who were following the guide felt horror, even a little bit of disappointment, though. Even now, the wilderness permeating parts of Florida can be downright daunting. 8 decades ago, Florida didn't exactly make life easier than it does today. The guide's side trips to the beach, which they were about to start doing, promised a traveler relief from the mosquito colonies living in the swampy woods swirling around the road, on which travelers should, according to the guide's deadpan warning, at least I hope that's how they meant it, watch for cattle. That was at the start of all but 2 of the chapters, that you had to be very careful because there were going to be a lot of cows on the road. Cattle aside, the guide's description of US 1 now does better suit A1A. With each mile, as the route proceeds southward, the vegetation becomes more tropical. Birds and marine life, not found in other parts of the U.S., inhabit marshes and rivers. Almost every side road leads to a sandy bathing beach or to a resort with fishing and sailing facilities. And with each mile southward, the temperature rises. The winter visitor, top-coated on entering the state, is often found in shirt sleeves in reaching Miami. Now, Florida has no mountains. A chief complaint Floridians hear is that our state is too flat. I kind of find this funny because anyone who looks can find a lot more wrong with us than not having high mountains, starting with the 2000 elections and ending with every news bit that has the word Florida man in it. The fact that I can ride my fixed gear bike almost anywhere I want is not really a downside. Technically, we're not flat. We just don't have mountains. We have hills, kind of, mostly in the Panhandle, and right down the middle of the state we have a ridge that rises out of the limestone that used to connect sand islands during the Pleistocene era. Of course, we have sand dunes like the ones here. Sand dunes support vegetation like sea oats and railroad vines, which hold the sand together and let more things grow in them. Eventually they'll support trees, and along the water's edge, like you see on Fernandina, they prevent beach erosion. Here, you see the high dunes inland as well as along the beach, and when they need it, they do get a bit of help from Caterpillar. So, while we're in Fernandina, we stop at Putt, Florida. Now, Putt, Florida, this is an actual hole on the golf course, mini golf course, has been around since 1959, charming people with all the faked crashed airplanes and gator pits filled with future handbags that it doesn't have. This is a no-nonsense, no-frills golf course, mini golf course. But what does make it one of the 2 coolest putt-putt places in Florida is that it is right on the beach, just behind those piles of sand they pile there. Just south, Amelia Island evokes images of the South Carolina Lowcountry, although that's not how we say it down here. Grass peeps through the water, creating brown and green mazes through the Tiger Point Marina and fronting boatyards before it flows into a beach forest. A canopy of green trees closes over the road, punctuated only occasionally by glimpses of the Atlantic. If you look hard enough, you can find American Beach, which is marked by a simple sign. However, if you're speeding, you will miss it. American Beach was Florida's first beach strictly for African Americans. Abraham Lincoln Lewis, president of Florida's first insurance company and, not coincidentally, Florida's first black millionaire, bought 200 acres of beach in 1935 with the intention of creating a place where his black workers could recreate and own property, calling it recreation and relaxation without humiliation. Now, Bethune Beach by Daytona Beach was another beach where African Americans could enjoy their separate but equal status. But American Beach is the only one that really remains relatively undisturbed. It lacks the Ritz of the Ritz-Carlton, which is directly to its north, or even the luxury of Amelia Island Plantation, which is a lovely name, right to its south. But the American Beach families have mostly held on to their land, and some of the houses do stand empty, some are crumbling and look like they're about to go through demolition through neglect, but others still shine. Whatever their physical state, the spirit of the beach remains strong, and the homeowners do tend to still have a lot of get-togethers. Florida's Department of Environmental Protection runs the state park system, and parks cover the best real estate on this northeast end of the coast. Fort Clinch, Amelia Island, Big Talbot, Little Talbot, Pumpkin Hill Creek Preserve, Yellow Bluff Fort, and Fort George Island State Parks dot this edge of the state, and they have palms, sand dunes, hiking trails, and wildlife instead of condos, strip malls, and luxury resorts. Here, A1A is called the Buccaneer Trail, and it crosses dunes and driftwoods, opening occasionally to reveal slices of Alabaster Beach or a little tiny bit of Cobalt Sea. The name Buccaneer Trail evokes images of pirates adorned with fancy black boots and puffy shirts, swashbuckling across the dunes, sword fighting perched atop cabbage palm driftwood, all the while swatting at mosquitoes, of course, and then returning with a big old glass of rum. Little Talbot Island reveals grass over water vistas with moss-draped oaks right from most of their campsites. When we park tonight, we have a little ritual. Barry sets up the camper and I get out of his way. So I take Calypso, put her on the leash, and walk her down to the water. Now we're about 50 feet from the water when I notice a fisherman crouched by the shore, and he's holding what looks like a little rattlesnake with its head under the water, which I thought was a little weird. I caught it with my rod and my reel, he says, and then he explains how snakes can swim if they want to, and he's going to drown it. But don't tell no one because it's illegal. I know that. I don't say anything because sometimes I don't have the gentlest demeanor, and he's holding a venomous snake. I really don't want to make him angry. His attempts to hold the little tiny head under the water aren't working, and finally Barry comes up behind me and he intervenes because he's a little bit nicer, and he says, "Why do you want to kill the snake?" And the guy says, "Well, you wouldn't want it waiting for you when you stepped out of your camper in the morning, would it?" Now, Barry is a boat captain who takes boats across Lake Okeechobee, where when you stop for dinner, you have to kick water moccasins off the dock just to get back to your boat. Also, when he was a kid, he got bit by a rattlesnake, so he's not real worried about it. And he says to the guy, "You know, the snake doesn't want to be there either." And he just walks away. So the guy, I guess because he realizes you can't drown a snake, goes over to the sand, grabs the snake by the head, and starts trying to stuff his head back into the sand. This to me kind of proves that God watches out for fools and children, because this whole thing took about 10 minutes and he didn't seem to get bit. Finally, one of his friends comes over and kind of points over, because there's all these trees and these islands, and they have this conversation. And finally, the guy kind of shakes his head and takes a snake and he whips it across the field of grass, where I figure the snake just probably landed trying to figure out what the hell just happened and runs off into the grass. There were a lot of snakes on this tour, and there were a lot of snakes by the water. I never had any problems with any of them coming up to me. Of course, I never tried to drown any of them either, so. In the 16th century, the French boat captain Jean Ribault led a star-crossed expedition near Florida's northeast coast. Now, there were actually two expeditions in 1565. One was Spanish, one was French, and they both made landfall along the shoreline about 2 days and 50 miles apart. France sent 600 colonists to help the 300 Frenchmen who were already there and trying to settle Fort Carolyn the year before. Pedro Menendez de Aviles led 600 Spaniards to St. Augustine, and his plans, of course, were to convert the indigenous people to Christianity by force or by reason, because really they weren't fussy. So both groups knew about the other. They both expected problems with the other. They weren't disappointed. The accounts differ depending on if you read the French accounts or the Spanish accounts, but the guide says that both forces took the offensive. There was a hurricane that came up, and it shipwrecked the French captain Ribault. It also cloaked Menendez's attack. Now, had Ribault paid more attention to the weather, we might have more French-named forts along St. Augustine today than we do, but he didn't, so we've got a lot of Spanish-named forts. We do have one remaining symbol or homage to the shipwrecked boat captain, and I find it somewhat ironic because it is a ferry that carries cars across the St. Johns River. It's called the Jean Ribault. Jacksonville Beach is our next stop, and it contrasts sharply with pretty much everything we've seen north of here, because it has a very built-out, no view of the beach, chain store stretch of A1A that resembles something like a suburb on the sand. However, it doesn't last very long, and at Ponte Vedra Beach, the landscape changes back abruptly and the route grows more and more forested again. The only difference is now we're starting to see huge homes on the dunes on the seaside, almost entirely blocked from the road by these walls of palm and oak. The west side of the roads is more of a shorter tangle of palm, oak, cabbage palm, short grasses, things like that. And as we move south, it turns into nothing but sand dunes, saw palmetto, and maybe a cabbage palm, but not very many tall trees. When we get just north of St. Augustine, we have to turn into the land and go down US 1 just for a short stretch. And it's just south of Volano Beach, we hit Davenport, where this is a 1927 merry-go-round that actually has only been in Davenport for about 20 years. Just south of the merry-go-round, which by the way costs $1. It's on city park property. Someone leases it and runs it on behalf of the park. You leave there, you go to St. Augustine. And America's oldest city predates Jamestown by almost a century. It was 1500s, and it is not ashamed. Everything here is the first city, the first graveyard, the first daiquiri. Anything that can be the first, that's St. Augustine. We also find, of course, the Fountain of Youth, which isn't hard because it's on every map and sign anywhere you go in the city. Now, the Fountain of Youth is one part tourist attraction, one part museum, and absolutely no parts reality. Ponce de Leon was far too embroiled in a long-distance political battle to even care about a Fountain of Youth. He never went looking for one. He never mentioned a Fountain of Youth anywhere in anything he wrote, none of his letters, none of his journals. Here's what happened. Gonzalo Fernandez de Oviedo y Valdez, a Spanish court chronicler, didn't like Ponce de Leon. He said he was dumb, gullible, and narcissistic. His harsh assessment of his personality probably had something to do with the fact that Oviedo had an allegiance to Christopher Columbus's son, Diego. Ponce de Leon was governor of Puerto Rico, but Diego wanted control of Puerto Rico. So this bitterness continued, and as with a lot of politics, it didn't end just because somebody died. After Ponce de Leon died, Oviedo couldn't let it go, and he wrote this little bit of satire about Ponce de Leon being so dumb and gullible that he followed these Indians into the forests of Florida looking for the Fountain of Youth. Now here's the thing, when he wrote that, people knew it was satire. They knew it was a joke. It was supposed to make fun of him. Within 100 years, it became fact. And ever since that time, we've all, historians included, have talked about Ponce de Leon searching for the Fountain of Youth. And, throughout our history, tourist-dependent groups pretty much everywhere in Florida have claimed that this is where Ponce really found the Fountain of Youth. I think the closest one we have here is probably just south of here by Sarasota. We have about 2 gazillion and 3 springs in Florida, so it's not really hard for a group to find a spring and go, oh, this must have been what he meant. Fortunately, St. Augustine does have a little bit more on offer than Eternal Life. The colonial Spanish Quarter, Flagler's College, Flagler College, it was a hotel, now it's a college, the city gates, and pretty much all of the city. We kind of devised our own walking tour. We didn't really want to go through the Spanish Quarter because it's a little more commercial. So we ended up walking past Flagler College. The city hall has some beautiful property. And walking down the streets, it felt almost like New Orleans Garden District, if you've ever walked down the residential areas along the waterfront. That's where we finished our tour, and across from Castillo de San Marcos, which is the large fort there, I see a cemetery. And I walk by it, and I'm like, God, this is beautiful. I wonder who was lucky enough to get buried here. And then I see the sign. Yellow fever victims were lucky enough to get buried here. So we stopped next at Flagler Beach, which is also at the end of State Road 100. And this is almost the first of several beach towns that time forgot. Everything here kind of feels like an old Kodak camera picture instead of a new digital one. Even the sand has a cinnamon color, and you can see the orange roof of the beach house there. It just really feels like an old photograph. And this part of A1A runs right on top of sand dunes, and the beach is about 15 feet down. We make a really slow circle of the town. It doesn't take long. One building houses everything the city needs. There's not a lot of development. And I find out later that they have a height restriction that's kept the development down. The height restrictions are in the center of the town at Veterans Park, and they don't allow anything taller than 2 feet in case someone ever wants to put a hotel behind it. This became a problem when the Shuffleboard Club put up a box that was 3 feet. And there were city hall meetings, there was an outcry, and the Shuffleboard Club did have to take it down. Now on the beach, you can't, which by the way, you can't see it. The dunes and the sea oats pretty much obstruct the whole beach. And you can't see the A1A when you're down there either. So it's like this little subterranean seashore you have to walk down to get to. Aside from a lone Dollar General, because they are everywhere, everything appears locally owned and doing just fine. We park the car and we're walking down the beach, and I start to think, we could come back here. And then I realized, probably after a day there's nothing to do, and that sounds okay. I can see myself at the Beachfront Motel, which is its name and location, waiting to get shrimp at a place called the Funky Pelican, and everywhere you go you can hear the waves. It seemed delightful. We did have to leave though because we're not nearly far enough south for where we need to be in the week. And just past Flagler Beach, the saw palmettos and the pine trees come back. They start to cover the dunes, and you start to see a little bit of sand and water but not much houses and not much development. In South Flagler County and North Volusia County, the road's just kind of a ribbon balanced on the sand. And if you look down, these are as close to as we get as cliffs in Florida, because you are perched right there. You get the feeling that one good hurricane would take out the road here. Now, this is Bethune Beach at the corner of Daytona Beach, and it's pretty much a sharp contrast because, well, Ferris wheel and a giraffe. The Ferris wheel is still there. They have added a roller coaster. The intersections are pink and blue brick, and the hotels are all Akutiki and Ohana Luau. There is a Hawaiian Falls Golf that has a tiki hut office and volcanoes that I think they said erupted every time you get a hole-in-one. From there, it's a short hop until we get to a Bell's department store in Ormond by the Sea, where we start to get a little more populated, but then we're right back into the North Peninsula, which is a state park. We stopped for the night at Canaveral National Seashore. Jetty Park is a small campground that's run by the Port Authority, and it looks like when it's crowded, it's probably a nightmare because the campsites are one on top of the other, but we went there in September and we were one of 2 cars, so it was really more spooky than anything else. It is one of the few beaches I was able to go to where it did not expressly say my dog could not be on the beach. So Calypso, who's a little dachshund, she didn't cause any trouble. She got to run down the beach, and I wasn't worried about going to some kind of jail or getting a ticket with it. Now, in the morning, we string our way between a series of beaches intended for tourists, finally arriving at Cocoa Beach. Now, through Cocoa Beach, A1A splits into what you could call a divided highway if it wasn't covered with sand all the time. Basically, it's just 2 one-way streets with some shops in the middle, a cigar bar, a restaurant, a tiki head building store. It's not a museum, it's not a gallery, it's a store where they build tiki heads. After breakfast, I announced that, of course, this is my favorite place. I've said this every morning on the trip, so I think it's starting to lose some of its truthiness. We eat at Roberto's, which is a Cuban cafe, and it's had the same owners for decades. If you go, they have something called a surfer special, which is an egg over easy over black beans and yellow rice served with Cuban breads. Surfers come here, that's why it gets the name, the breakfast. They also go to nearby Ranjan, which is the first out of many in the state. But non-surfers know this stretch for 2 other reasons: Cape Canaveral, and of course, I Dream of Jeannie. If you walk through Kennedy Space Center at Port Canaveral, which was called Cape Kennedy, it deals primarily with the space industry. Now, if you go through Cocoa Beach, almost everything has a space motif. However, there is, right by Ranjan, Laurie Wilson Park, and they have renamed the lane in the park I Dream of Jeannie Way. This is, of course, where they based I Dream of Jeannie. There is a naval station just south of here. We don't stop there, though. We stop at Mccarty Treasure Museum, which is built near the site of a 1750 Spanish shipwreck. We learn at the museum that the queen at the time, Elizabeth, wouldn't consummate the marriage until she received her dowry, which included emeralds, pearls, and a coral rosary. There were 8 chests in all, valued at the time at 14 million pesos. The treasure was lost in the July 30th shipwreck. They tried to resend other treasure 2 more times that were lost in 2 other shipwrecks. It seems like kind of a high price to pay to consummate a marriage, but apparently there was some politics involved. So the museum does all that. What you're seeing here is what's behind the museum, and it is a wooden elevated stand built to look like the deck of a ship. When we get back on the road, something starts to happen. We start to see these blue things in the middle of the road. And for the next several miles, we see blue crabs, blue land crabs about this big, trying to cross A1A. It feels like I'm in the middle of a B movie because I can't avoid them. Even though these animals are land dwellers, what they do is they lay their eggs in the shallows. So basically, these crabs are playing some kind of real-life Frogger while they're in labor, carrying 30,000 to 70,000 babies. And every crab I run over because I can't avoid it. You cannot avoid it. There are too many. I realize I'm potentially killing 70,001 crabs. But it was really cool. They don't do it all the time. A little scary until you know what you're doing or what it is. And then we come to Vero Beach, which is still a little more populated than a lot of the areas on the route, but not nearly as crowded as, say, Jacksonville Beach or something like that. South of State Road 60, we have to go back over to the mainland. And the second time we made this journey, we stopped in Stewart because on US 1 there's this nautical thrift shop, and we had just bought a house. We were in the car. This was the second trip, not the camper, although that probably would have made more sense. And we had this idea that we were going to landscape the outside of the house with some cut-off pilings and some nautical line, very heavy gauge, thick line, but we hadn't been able to find any. Well, I, of course, see it draped over a fence at this nautical junkyard. And I said, well, let's stop. You know, how much could it be? And I walk away because I am not the negotiator. That is not my job. When I come back, Barry's sitting there talking to the owner, and they have all of it, several hundred feet of it, mounded on top of my car. They're both just sitting there going, it's gonna be fine. It won't come off. It'll be fine. Don't worry about it. Now, do you remember when I said something earlier about a few relationship testing exceptions? Okay, this wasn't it. Toward its southern end, A1A starts to zigzag back and forth between the beach and the mainland, and back to the beach and back to the mainland. This would be frustrating, but fine if A, the changes were clearly marked, and B, they were clearly marked more than 2 feet before you had to make your turn. Both times we drove the route, we did the same thing wrong. I knew this because I instantly recognized the same landmarks that we were lost in front of the second time. We are not that clever, but we are consistent. So when we saw the same buildings, we went, oh yeah, we need to go back. So I took the helm at this point, and I decided I was gonna drive it and Barry was gonna navigate. And I found myself asking him over and over again, are you sure this is A1A and not US 1? Because it feels kind of US 1-like. I didn't want to doubt him, but I was doubting him. And he is so rarely wrong that I felt bad asking, but he finally purses his lips together and he starts zooming in on his iPhone with his fingers, and I was so happy because he's never wrong. It was great. And he says, you know what, there's 2 A1As, and we need to really zoom in to see it, but I think we need to turn around. So I do, and at this point I'm hungry, and I'm never pleasant when I'm hungry, and I'm tired, and there's a bunch of line on top of my car, and I'm not paying that much attention when I run a red light, which happens to be a red light with a red light camera. So 3 weeks later, I open up the mail and I get this bill for me running a red light, and there's no doubt that it's me because this is what I see. Now, the lesson here is always zoom in when you're navigating A1A. It really does get tricky because even Magellan would have been confused. I promise you, it was not Barry's fault. It is a very poorly marked area of the road. Now, after that, it gets a lot easier, and at Palm Beach, we're back out on the Barrier Islands. And this is the 1920s era Lake Worth Casino. The view's fronting the Atlantic. And it's not a gambling casino. It's a public hall that includes right now an oceanfront park, cabana rentals, a few restaurants, fudge shop, and I think a ballroom squeezed in there somewhat. This is where the area starts to get rich. And not just rich like we have here. This is Ivana Trump rich. Hedges stretch about 20 feet into the air in front of all the houses, protecting them from the common folk who dare drive this road. We go through this really fancy shopping district. We enjoy the landscaping, and it offers the homeowners privacy, but what it also does is it lets us feel like we're the only ones on the road. After this fancy area, we come out in an area called Briny Breezes. Now, you leave this really fancy area and you go through this tunnel of oaks and sea grapes and all kinds of subtropical trees, and you come out and everything's small again. There's no hedges, the foliage almost disappears, the mansions are gone. These homes are actually much cooler to me. It's a residential version of Flagler Beach. It's this little vintage blip on the map, and it's tiny. They have slash pines, they have sea grapes, and they do kind of tower over the road, but it's not something that's done to keep people out. It's just because they never cut them down. And it kind of stands right next to the Palm Beach area, and it makes you realize the ridiculousness of taking these big mansions and wedging them in right next to each other. This is where we stop for the night, and the next day we go to Hollywood Beach, which looks like a lovely town to get mugged in. It was very poor, although Jimmy Buffett was building a Margaritaville resort, which I understand is now open, so this should change the demographic of the town incredibly. Now, it makes sense because we're just north of Miami-Dade, and you see Margaritaville, it'll bring people in, and then of course they're gonna come from the south where it is wealthy. We are starting to see a lot of turquoise paint, jalousie windows, deco buildings. Before that though, we have to go through North Beach. And the odd marriage of the grand architecture that you see on the South Beach juxtaposed with the extreme poverty of the North Beach is jarring. North Beach is filled with these really, I'm sure they were beautiful once, but they're just empty now, and they have bars on the windows and they're crumbling. And just as you feel like, my God, I can't take this anymore, you go into South Beach where you get a cheap hotel room for $300 a night. We didn't stay there. The southbound lane, like the northbound lane, A1A divides again here, is, well, it used to be very exclusive. It's still expensive, but now it has things like a Gap, a Banana Republic, Alvin's Island, which is a tropical department store. Down here, the closest thing I could compare it to would be Surf Style. If you've ever been out to the beach, you've seen a Wings or a Surf Style. Alvin's Island is the same type of thing. The northbound lane of A1A is a little bit more exclusive. Did you see the birdcage with Robin Williams, Nathan? Yeah, that wasn't exaggerating. That's the northbound lane of A1A. The Art Deco buildings are painted in very intense colors that are not unlike the ones we saw in the little towns. They're just very saturated and bright. So now if you want to go any further south, you have to leave A1A and go back to US 1, which takes you into the Florida Keys. You can follow US 1 there, or just before something called the Last Chance Saloon, you can take Card Sound Road. It's a little road to your left. It's not very well marked. You'll miss it until you see the sign, which means you're past it. And it's kind of a back door into the Florida Keys. Now, the first time I went to the Keys, I was in college, and I went as part of a class I was taking because I took the best classes. Our professor took us for a weekend field trip to the Keys, and we came down through US 1, and we went through just this tangled tunnel of mangroves, 2-lane road, very strict signs, no passing, no passing, no passing, speed kills, you're gonna die if you pass. I mean, it was very ominous. But the minute you're done with that, you come out over a small bridge and you're over something called Snake Creek, and the water's changed color completely. It's green. Now, a few years ago, road improvements in the form of a fixed span bridge and some widening of the road altered that familiar vista. So I started taking Card Sound Road a lot more. It winds through the mangroves. It does also have a fixed span bridge, the Card Sound Bridge. And right before you cross over through the toll booth, there is a wonderful dive bar called Alabama Jack's. Now, I'm generally too anxious to stop, and upon leaving, I'm usually too sad to stop, because there's this toll booth that SunPass doesn't work. You have to have cash. Don't try and go through it without it. These are not state employees who are friendly with the little shirts. No, no, no. And there's a sign that says, "Don't forget your keys." All the way along this road, though, you see stacks of crab traps and lobster traps, and they remind you that in Florida, seafood really is our big business. There is really not a key along this stretch where you can't stop and taste local fish. In the Keys, you can of course get salmon, you can get tuna, but why would you bother? Because they have yellowtail snapper, mangrove snapper, grouper, flounder. They came from the local boats, and when something's caught that day, it really does taste better than after it makes it up here to us. Now, you start to get the idea, and it's true, that there is nowhere else in Florida that you're further from the south. The Florida Keys could be their own country, and actually at one point, very briefly, they were. It goes back to the 1980s. I don't know if anybody remembers this, but the DEA set up a roadblock getting out of Key West. And the story that's told that accompanies that is what Jimmy Buffett would call a mostly true story. He's a part-time Keys resident, but it goes something like this. The residents didn't like that they had to stop at the roadblock to leave. This may have been because a lot of them were actually running drugs, but not all of them. They were upset about it. So they rebelled. They called themselves Conk, and they rebelled at the idea of this. They seceded from the United States, declared war on the United States, immediately surrendered and asked for reparations, which they did not get. So the first time I was in the Keys is also the first time I went snorkeling at John Penny Camp Coral Reef State Park. And it's the country's first underwater state park, and it does have a few beaches, quite a lot of chances to kayak, campsites, walking trails, a little bit of hiking, but this park is really made for people who want to go underwater. Tour boats take snorkelers out, I think about every hour, to whatever reef the boat captains think are the calmest and the clearest. And on this day, we went out to North Dry Rocks. I saw, there was everything. I mean, this was quite a while ago. There was plum-colored fan corals, brain coral, fire coral, huge starfish, eels, barracuda, parrotfish. Even the barracuda didn't bother me because I had read this cute little story from a Jacques Cousteau book about how barracudas would play this game with scuba divers where they would swim right at their fins until the diver freaked out and turned around, and then the barracuda would swim right at them and dart away at the last minute. And diver would go back to doing what he was doing. The barracuda would go back to the fin, follow behind the diver until the diver freaked out again. He would swim back at him, and Jacques Cousteau said this could go on for hours without the barracuda getting irritated. So they didn't bother me that much. And at some point on this trip, the teacher for the class pokes a head up and goes, "Hey, there's a shark over there on the reef." There's about 12 of us in the water. About 7 people go back to the boat, and I, along with 4 other people, decide to go see the shark because we are young and we are immortal and we want to see the shark. And it was a shark. In fact, it was 2 sharks. And we kept our distance. We didn't get that far. The sharks stayed on the reef. They were very aware of us, didn't come at us. Obviously, I still have all my fingers and arms and legs. It was fine. But when they swam off the reef, not that we could have caught them, we didn't try. We went back to the snorkel boat. And when we started talking about it, well, you know, the other people, of course, said, "What the hell were you thinking?" And we were all thinking we could swim faster than 2 other people. That was, so that was our shark, and that was the Florida Keys. Now, every trip I make to the Keys, just like every town along A1A, is a little bit different. I've never seen a shark since. I've wanted to, although I have gotten a little smarter about staying in the water with them. I've stayed at a state park there. I've stayed at vintage hotels that were clean and vintage hotels that were not so clean. Camped in a tent. I've really stayed in everywhere up there except for the expensive places, and it's still different. I've taken boats 70 miles off the coast of Fort Jefferson to the Dry Tortugas, which is where Samuel Mudd served time for setting John Wilkes Booth's leg, until everybody caught yellow fever and he cured it and they decided he could have his freedom. This final leg of the WPA tour really isn't the end of the road. It's the beginning of the Caribbean. Now, as I said at the beginning, Barry and I both kind of dreaded A1A, and that's really not an uncommon feeling. A1A is Florida's great misunderstood road. It's an extended metaphor for Florida, I think. You know, it's a smattering of everything, and it's really more wild than we think it is. There's a lot more forest, beach forest, than we think about. Everyone who's visited A1A, just like everyone who's visited Florida, judges the whole of the road based on what they have seen. However, Florida, just like A1A, is more than the sum of its parts. Thank you very much.